Most people think power is something you can see. A crown on a head, a throne in a palace, a general on a battlefield. But the most dangerous power in history was never loud. It never marched. It never shouted. It whispered. It shaped laws, decided who mattered and who didn't. And for nearly 1,000 years, one class of people mastered this invisible power better than anyone else in the ancient world. They were called the patricians. And even though their name has faded, their system never did. Long before Rome became an empire, before marble temples and golden statues, it was a small, rough settlement along the Tiber River. Life was brutal. Survival was everything.
Yes.
But even in this early chaos, a quiet hierarchy was forming. Certain families claimed divine ancestry. They said their bloodlines were chosen by the gods themselves. These families became known as the patricians, not because they were richer, not because they were stronger, but because they believed they were destined to rule. This belief alone changed everything. In ancient Rome, belief was power. If people believed you were meant to lead, they would follow without force. Patricians understood this deeply. They didn't just control land. They controlled stories. They wrote the past. They shaped traditions. They told the people who they were and who they would never be. From the beginning, Roman society was divided. So on one side were the patricians, the elite families who controlled religion, law, politics, and land. On the other side were the plebeians, farmers, craftsmen, traders, laborers, the majority, the builders of Rome. But they had almost no political power, and this was not accidental. The patricians designed Rome to look shared while keeping it privately owned. They created councils. They created assemblies. They created titles. But the rules behind them all were written by patrician hands. If you were not born into the right family, your voice did not matter. You could fight for Rome. You could die for Rome. But you could never rule Rome. At least, that was the plan. Patrician children were raised differently. From birth, they were taught they were superior, not smarter superior. Law, philosophy, and warfare. They were trained to speak, persuade, and command. Meanwhile, plebeian children were taught to work, to obey, to endure. This wasn't just class. It was identity programming. If a plebeian believed he was born to serve, he would never question why he served. Patricians also controlled religion. They became high priests, interpreters of omens, guardians of sacred rituals. If something went wrong, famine, war, disease, they told the people it was the God's will. And if a patrician ruled, it was also the God's will. Power wrapped in divinity becomes unquestionable. For centuries, this system worked beautifully. Rome expanded. Patrician generals led armies. Patrician senators wrote laws. Patrician priests spoke for the gods. The people obeyed because they believed there was no alternative. But then something unexpected happened. The plebeians began to notice. They noticed they fought in wars but had no land. They noticed they paid taxes but had no voice. They noticed their sons died, but patrician sons inherited power. They noticed that justice always favored the same families, and one day they did something no one expected. They walked away. In an act known as the secession of the plebs, the working class of Rome left the city and refused to return unless their rights were recognized. No soldiers, no farmers, no workers. For the first time, the patricians felt fear, not because of violence, but because of absence. Power cannot exist without. People, this moment changed Roman history forever. To prevent total collapse, the patricians were forced to compromise. New offices were created. Tribunes were elected to represent the plebeians. Some laws were written down instead of being kept secret by patrician priests. Slowly, painfully, the monopoly of power began to crack, but the patricians never lost control completely. They adapted. They married into powerful plebeian families. They used wealth to influence elections. They created new forms of dominance that looked like cooperation. They learned that invisible control lasts longer than visible force, and this is where their legacy becomes terrifying. Because this same strategy exists today. You don't need to be called a patrician anymore. You just need to own the system. Over time, Rome grew. Wars were fought. Territories were taken. Wealth poured into the city. And with wealth came new elites. But the old patrician families always found ways to stay on top. They controlled land. They controlled inheritance. They controlled marriage alliances. They controlled political offices. They understood something fundamental. If you control generations, you control history. Many patricians were not even the smartest or bravest, but they were born into a machine that protected them, a machine that crushed outsiders, a machine that rewarded loyalty and punished rebellion, and most people didn't even realize they were inside it. The patricians also mastered image. They presented themselves as protectors of tradition, guardians of Roman values. They said without them, Rome would collapse into chaos. They framed their rule as stability, not dominance. This is the oldest trick in power. Make people afraid of change, and they will defend their chains. As Rome expanded into an empire, the patrician spirit did not disappear, it transformed. Emperors rose, but behind them were old families, old networks, old money. Even when titles changed, control remained familiar. The patricians had built something greater than laws. They had built a worldview where hierarchy felt natural, where inequality felt logical, where power felt inherited. And once a society accepts that, it becomes nearly impossible to dismantle. If this is already making you see history differently, take a moment to subscribe to Echoes of Times. We uncover the stories behind the stories, the systems behind the empires, so you can understand the world with new eyes, because what I'm about to tell you next explains not just Rome but us. The patricians understood something that most rulers in history never truly grasped. If you want lasting power, you cannot rule only bodies, you must rule minds. Force creates obedience, but belief creates loyalty. And loyalty, once planted deeply enough, becomes self-sustaining. The patricians didn't just want people to obey them, they wanted people to need them, so they turned law into theater. In early Rome, laws were not written down. They were memorized and interpreted by patrician priests and magistrates. This meant that justice was not something you could read. It was something you were told. And what you were told depended on who you were. A patrician could bend the law. A plebeian could only endure it. The same action could be forgiven in one man and punished in another. This wasn't corruption. This was design. When the plebeians demanded that laws be written and made public, the patricians resisted fiercely. Because once people can read the rules, they can challenge them. Still, pressure grew. Riots spread. The city became unstable. Finally, the patricians agreed to carve the laws into bronze tablets and place them in the public square. These became known as the 12 Tables. Historians often describe this as a victory for the people, but what they rarely explain is how carefully controlled this victory was. The laws were written by patricians. They allowed just enough fairness to prevent rebellion, but not enough to threaten power. This is a pattern you will see again and again in history. Elites do not resist change. They reshape it to survive. Marriage was another tool. Patricians initially forbade marriage between themselves and plebeians, not because of romance, but because of bloodlines. Power had to remain pure. Inheritance had to remain predictable. Wealth had to remain concentrated. Even love was regulated. When this ban was finally lifted, it was not out of kindness. It was because wealthy plebeians had emerged. Merchants, military heroes, men with influence. The patricians adapted again. They didn't fight the new elite. They absorbed it. Power doesn't disappear. It recruits. Patricians also mastered the art of public generosity. They sponsored games, feasts, temples, and monuments. They gave food to the poor. They paid for festivals. They presented themselves as benevolent fathers of the city. This created emotional dependency. If your survival depends on someone's generosity, you will defend them even when they exploit you. This is not kindness, it is strategy. The Roman Forum was not just a marketplace. It was a stage. Senators gave speeches. Generals displayed trophies. Priests performed rituals. Everything was symbolic. Every stone whispered authority. People were not just living in Rome, they were constantly being reminded who ruled it. The patricians turned politics into performance, and they were brilliant at it. But power always has a cost. As Rome expanded, it consumed lands, cultures, and people. Wealth flooded into the city. Slaves became common. Luxury became normal. Something inside the patrician class began to rot. They grew detached. They no longer knew hunger. They no longer feared poverty. They no longer understood the lives of the people they ruled. And rulers stop understanding the ruled, instability begins. The plebeians gained more rights over time. They could vote, they could hold certain offices. Some even became wealthy. But the core structure remained untouched. The highest priesthoods, the most sacred rituals, the deepest political influence, these stayed in the hands of old families. The patricians had learned that visible power attracts enemies. Invisible power lasts longer. Then came the age of generals. Men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar rose, not because of their noble blood, but because of their armies. Soldiers became more loyal to their commanders than to the state. This terrified the old elite. They had built a system where power was inherited, not seized. Now, power was being earned. This was dangerous. Civil wars erupted. Rome bled itself. The Republic trembled. And in this chaos, the patrician worldview faced its greatest challenge. What happens when people stop believing the system is natural? Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, not just with an army, but with an idea. That power did not belong to families. It belonged to those who could take it. When he was assassinated, the old elite believed they had saved the Republic. They were wrong. They had only proven that the old rules no longer worked. Out of the ashes rose emperors, and many believed this meant the patricians had lost. They hadn't. They had evolved. They became advisors, senators, priests, bankers, landowners. They learned that ruling from behind the curtain is safer than ruling from the throne. Emperors came and went. Families remained. The names changed. The control didn't. And this is where their legacy becomes truly unsettling. Because the patricians didn't just shape Rome, they shaped Western civilization. They influenced how law was written, how property worked, how inheritance was structured, how families preserved wealth, how social classes were justified, how power was disguised as tradition. Even the idea that some people are naturally suited to lead is a patrician invention. When Rome finally collapsed, people assumed the system died with it. It didn't. It scattered. It entered churches, kingdoms, banking houses, universities, governments. It hid behind new words: nobility, aristocracy, elite, upper class, old money, establishment. Different names, same structure. And the most brilliant part, most people stopped seeing it. They began to believe inequality was normal. They began to believe hierarchy was natural, began to believe power was deserved. That was the final victory of the patricians. If this is making you question what you were taught about history, that's because history is usually written by those who benefit from it. The patricians did not only shape Rome's laws, they shaped Rome's conscience. They decided what was honorable, what was shameful, what made a person worthy of respect, and what made a person invisible. And once values are set by those in power, society begins to police itself. They taught that obedience was virtue, that loyalty to the state was sacred, that sacrifice was noble. But these ideals were not designed for everyone. They were designed for those at the bottom, for the laborers, for the soldiers, for the mothers who lost sons to wars that enriched families they would never meet. Honor was not freedom, was a leash disguised as meaning. Patricians lived by different rules. Their failures were called complex decisions. Their cruelty was called necessary order. Their indulgence was called culture. Their children inherited not only wealth, but forgiveness. A plebeian mistake could ruin a life. A patrician mistake could be forgotten. And when people asked why, the answer was always the same. That's just how things are. That phrase is older than Rome. The patricians also understood fear better than anyone. They didn't need to terrorize constantly. They only needed to make examples. A few public punishments, a few dramatic trials, a few visible humiliations. The message would spread on its own. People would begin to censor themselves, to limit their dreams, to shrink their voices. The greatest prisons have no walls. Over time, people began to internalize their position. They stopped imagining more. They stopped questioning why some were always above and others always below. This is when power becomes permanent, when the oppressed begin to think like the oppressor. Rome did not fall because of invasion alone. It fell because belief cracked. People stopped trusting the system. Soldiers stopped fighting for ideals. Farmers stopped believing in sacrifice. Citizens stopped believing that the elites were necessary. And when belief dies, empires follow. The patricians had built Rome to look eternal, but nothing built on imbalance can last forever. Yet here is the twist. Most history books never tell you. The patricians didn't lose. They migrated. Their methods moved into monarchies, into feudalism, into aristocracies, to colonial systems, into corporate boards, to political dynasties, into financial empires, into institutions that looked different but functioned the same. They learned that you no longer needed noble titles. You just needed access. Access to education, access to capital, access to influence, access to narrative. And the world quietly reorganized itself around those gates. Most people today do not live under kings. They still live under systems designed by the same logic. A few at the top, many at the bottom, and stories that explain why this is natural. You are told that hard work always leads to success. But not everyone starts at the same line. You are told the system is fair, but fairness is defined by those who benefit. You are told power is earned, but inheritance is invisible. These ideas did not come from nowhere. They were engineered. And the patricians were among the first to perfect them. Their greatest invention was not political. It was psychological. They taught people to confuse stability with justice. They taught people to fear collapse more than inequality. They taught people to defend systems that did not serve them. And once people defend their own limitations, power becomes effortless. This is why their legacy is not found in ruins. It is found in minds. It is found in how people judge themselves, in how they measure success, in how they accept their place, in how they assume some lives matter more than others. The patricians are gone, but patrician thinking remains. And here's the most important truth of all. Once you see this, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice how power hides, how language shapes belief, how systems reward silence, how history repeats, not in events, but in structure. And that awareness is dangerous to any system built on hierarchy, because awareness breaks spells. If this story made you see the world differently, then you are exactly why Echoes of Times exists. We don't just tell you what happened. We show you how it still affects you. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think modern society still runs on ancient power systems? Tell me in the comments. And if this opened your eyes, share this video with someone who still believes history is just about the past. Because the most powerful systems are not the ones you can see. They are the ones you live inside. Freedom does not begin with rebellion. It begins with understanding.